We live in a world where a crime can happen at anywhere and at any place. Something as small as going 15 miles over the speed limit to something more sinister like robbery that has gone wrong, that resulted in a death, or even worse, committing murder. As the years went by, forensic science and technology has advanced to a point where a fingerprint at a crime scene can be ran through by a computer database, or even facial recognition is enough to catch a perpetrator and be convicted. So in this video, we'll be going back in time and shedding light at two murder cases that have happened in Illinois. Number 2. A woman claims that in 1981 in Marshall, Illinois, that she saw the murder and cremation of a woman's body, but without ever finding the body, it would be tough for investigators and police to prosecute a murder case. But would police be able to gather enough evidence and be able to solve a murder case without ever finding a body, and bring justice for the woman's family for a crime that has happened over 5 years ago? A geologist, an old relationship fling, and an organic chemist would be enough to testify against the man to help solve this case. Marshall, Illinois is a farming community which is located right across the border from Indiana, and the closest town nearby is Champaign, Illinois. From Marshall to Champaign is an hour and 30 minutes away, and from Champaign to Chicago is a 2-hour drive away from the city. Coming up from a middle-class family, Fred and Charlotte Grabe were your ordinary married couple with 2 children, their daughter Jenny and their son Jeff. They both had an immense amount of land, being one of the biggest landowners in the county, and had a wealth amount of resources, and by all means they were not poor farmers. Part of their money came from Charlotte's inheritance and the other half was Fred's 800-acre farm. Fred Grabe was not hard to spot from a crowd, weighing at 254 pounds and being 6 feet and 3 inches tall. He was much easier to spot than his wife, who was 5 feet 3 inches tall and only weighing at 120 pounds. But with any marriage there will be ups and downs, but their marriage took so many twists and turns that ended tragically. Right after Fred and Charlotte got married, he divorced her, and less than a year they got remarried again. But in 1981, when Fred had to move out from the family mansion and move to a smaller cabin on the property called Pickens Place, and he continued to live there for the remainder of the divorce, Charlotte wanted a divorce from Fred because she found out that he was having an affair with a 24-year-old bartender named Vicky McAllister. But in the summer of July 1981, Charlotte left the house so she can work on the farm, but when the children were waiting for their mother to return back home for dinner, she never returned home. Out of panic, Jenny and Jeff decided to look for their mother outside as the sun was about to set, and they checked everywhere near around the farm, but they could find no trace of her. And that's when the children contacted the police to help find their mom. The next morning, the police got involved, and they interviewed Fred as they were the police's main suspect. Fred claimed that he saw her earlier that day on the day that she disappeared, and he said they both got into an argument near the storage shed on the Grabe's farm. As police were interviewing Fred's neighbor, one of the neighbors said that he saw 2 cars driving down the road earlier that day of Charlotte's disappearance. He recognized Fred as he was driving his car, and even though he saw Charlotte's car right behind him, the neighbor couldn't tell if it was Charlotte driving. A few days later, police found Charlotte's car right across the Indiana state line border, and when the police checked the inside of the car for any evidence, they didn't find any blood or a body. But what police did find in the car was a loaded handgun right underneath the passenger seat, and that was the only item that was recovered from the car. 2 weeks before Charlotte's disappearance, she left a note in a safety deposit box at a local bank, accusing Fred of stealing farming equipment, but also mentioning that she had doubts if she was going to be able to make it through the divorce and still be alive. Fearing for her own safety and her children's, Charlotte made a promise to her children before she disappeared, and she had told them that if she didn't come back home before 4:30 p.m. after working on the farm, they were supposed to go out and look for her. But with no physical evidence and nothing to tie back Fred, the investigation was on pause, and the case turned into a missing person case. 3 years passed by, and even with the $25,000 reward, no new information came up on Charlotte's disappearance. The children knew that something much more sinister had happened to their mother, and knowing that it was a missing person case, but also knowing that their father's violent behavior and his past, the police couldn't tie back Fred to the murder because everything that they had against him was circumstantial. But Jenny and Jeff never gave up trying to find their mother, because they knew that if they ever went missing, their mother would do the same for them. So in 1984, Charlotte's daughter Jenny hired a private investigator named Charles Pearson to look into the missing person case. Charles ended up finding out that Fred and the woman who he was having an affair with, Vicky McAllister, had broken up. So Charles tracked McAllister down in Indiana to talk to her about her relationship with Fred Grabe. Using investigation tactics, McAllister was able to open up about her experience being with Fred, and she was able to tell the private investigator on what exactly happened on the day of Charlotte's disappearance. But once she told Charles what happened to Charlotte, the story was so horrific and brutal, he couldn't believe what Vicky was saying was actually true, but she was the only eyewitness for the missing person case. Vicky claims that on the day of Charlotte's disappearance, Fred and Vicky were inside the storage shed because Vicky needed to borrow farming supplies. But when she heard Charlotte drive into the storage shed, Fred told Vicky to hide behind the tractor when Charlotte pulled up. Fred and Vicky began to have a verbal argument, and and the fight ended up turning physical. Fred struck Charlotte in the head and fell onto the ground as Fred laid on top of her, and he began to choke her unconscious several times, and would stop and wait for Charlotte to gain conscious just to continue the process. In the end, Fred choked Charlotte to death until to a point where her heart stopped beating, and then afterward, he sexually assaulted her while Vicky was watching behind the tractor. To get rid of the body, Fred grabbed a barrel inside the shed and put Charlotte's body in the barrel and headed towards the Wabash River to dispose of the body. Vicky and Fred drove in 2 separate cars, Fred driving in his car with the barrel containing Charlotte's body, and Vicky driving Charlotte's car to ditch it. Later on the same night of Charlotte's murder, Fred and Vicky were near the Wabash River, and Fred dumped gasoline fuel all in the barrel and set the barrel on fire. As Fred and Vicky watched the body burn for the rest of the night, the only remains left was Charlotte's human skull. Fred tossed the barrel and the skull into the river and watched the barrel float away. Charles told Vicky that if she testified against Fred Grabe, that she would be offered total immunity by the court, and that she wouldn't be charged as an accessory to the murder, which is a Class X felony in the state of Illinois, carrying a mandatory sentence of 20 years all the way to life. In Illinois, there's a law called the felony murder rule, which is a law that if a group of people were involved in committing a crime together, and the end result was someone dying, all 3 are responsible for the death, even though 2 people involved didn't hold the gun nor pull the trigger. But what was the motive behind Fred killing Charlotte? Vicky explained that Fred had promised her that once Charlotte was out of the picture, that they would be able to have Charlotte's inheritance and would be able to live on the family mansion and live happily ever after. But once Charlotte was murdered, Fred had left Vicky and moved on with his life, and Vicky ended up moving back to Indiana. So there was plenty of motive to commit murder, but it came down to 2 factors: money and greed. So in 1981, Vicky McAllister accepted the offer from the court and showed the police where the crime scene had happened and where the body was dumped, near the Wabash River right underneath the maple tree. While investigating the crime scene, one of the detectives had an idea that if there would be any diesel fuel fumes captured on the maple tree or near around the soil to indicate that there was a fire that took place to corroborate what Vicky was saying was true. So the geologist took samples of the soil near around the maple tree, but it came back negative. But the investigators took another unique approach. They wanted to see if the tree was exposed to any diesel fuel fumes. The inside of a tree trunk can show the history of a tree that can conclude the age and the weather conditions. Each ring in the trunk can show another year that went by, but since diesel fuel is toxic to trees, when a tree is absorbed by gasoline and fire, it kills the cells and affects the growth rate of a tree. So investigators cut off 5 branches from the tree, and when they counted back the rings, they found out that the rings from the tree trunk were slowed down in 1981. The growth rings from 1981 from Vicky's disappearance were much thinner than the earlier rings, but investigators couldn't figure out the reason why. So each of the 5 branches were grounded into sawdust and given to an organic chemist at U of I. He injected each sample into a gas chromatography. A gas chromatography is what separates the chemical compound of a sample and then detects them to determine their appearance and compound. The results showed that the presence of hydrocarbon, the main compound of diesel fuel, was found in 2 out of the 5 branches, and those 2 branches were on the side of the tree where Vicky said that the body was burning, and the other 3 branches came back negative. So what Vicky McAllister was saying to Charles Pearson was true, and the forensic evidence corroborated her story. Armed with the forensic evidence, Fred Grabe was arrested and charged with murder, and he pled not guilty. During the trial, Vicky McAllister was offered total immunity in exchange to testify against Fred. But in a strange coincidence, the house once Fred and Charlotte shared, and the house next door that Charlotte's son Jeff and his wife Cindy built, was mysteriously burned while Fred was awaiting for trial. Arson investigators believe that both of the fires were set intentionally, but luckily Jeff and Cindy weren't home at the time of the arson, and no one was home. But 2 months before Fred was about to go on trial for his murder case, Jeff was supposed to testify against his dad, but unfortunately, Jeff was murdered in his home in California with 3 bullet wounds to the chest. Fred was involved in a fraud scheme with 3 other conspirators to launder $7 million in stolen and forged notes, which he double-crossed his partners, and the end result for him was death. But in the case of Jeff Grabe murder was never solved. So in June 1985, the trial was officially over. The judge found Fred Grabe guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 75 years in prison at Shawnee Correctional Center at Vina, Illinois. It's been 33 years since Fred Grabe has been incarcerated, and he will be eligible for parole in October of 2022. But do you think Fred Grabe's first attempt to hire someone to set fire and attempt to kill his own son and his wife failed? Or that he hired someone in California to orchestrate a murder hit on Jeff so he wouldn't testify against him during his trial? What do you think? Number 1. The infamous 1960 Starved Rock murder case. In 1960, 3 women were murdered at a national state park called Starved Rock, one of Illinois' top tourist attractions just an hour and 30 minutes away from Chicago. With over 2,630 acres of land and different activities and tourist attractions to see, Starved Rock is one of the top tourist attractions in the state. But what happens when a vacation trip doesn't always go exactly how it's planned? and something more sinister comes into play. In the March of 1960, 3 women, Frances Murphy, Mildred LaQuist, and Lillian Oding, took a 4-day vacation to go birdwatching and hiking to get away from the city life and be surrounded by the nature and scenery for the weekend. As they checked into the Starved Rock Lodge and continued on with their vacation, they never checked out of the lodge nor returned back home. 2 days passed by and one of the women's husbands became concerned and decided to call the lodge and ask if they were still in the room. The staff went and checked the women's room, and all of the women's belongings were there, and there was nothing out of the ordinary for the staff to be concerned. They decided to conduct a search party, thinking that the women ended up getting lost along the trails and could still be out there seeking for help. A few hours into the search party, one of the rescuers decided to go into the St. Louis Canyon, and as he entered the cave, he stumbled across something horrific. 3 bodies helplessly laying on the ground, dead and partially nude with severe head trauma. Autopsy reports showed that the women were tied up with binding rope, and that the killer had used a frozen tree limb as the murder weapon, as he hit each of them up to 100 times to the head. When the investigation first started for the triple murder case, headlines about the case made it worldwide on TV and newspaper, and police were under extreme pressure to solve the case. Police had 0 leads and no evidence to compare it with, and any evidence that they found near around the crime scene was ruined due to the weather conditions at the time. When the investigation first started, police suspected that the murders were committed by at least 2 men, and police decided that they were going to set up roadblocks near around Starved Rock, stopping all vehicles entering and leaving the area, looking for men who had bruises and scratch marks on their face and body. Police interviewed more than 200 people, and they all went through polygraph tests, but they had no luck until a few months later into the investigation that the police finally got their first solid lead. An employee that worked at the Starved Rock Lodge came forward and told the police that the day after the triple murder, that one of the co-workers came into work and had scratch marks on his face, and when he had asked him how the scratch marks came upon his face, he explained that it was his pet that scratched him. Knowing about the triple murder case, the employee became suspicious and decided to call the police with the information. Police identified the man as Chester Otto Weger, a 21-year-old dishwasher at the Starved Rock Lodge, married with 2 children, but when police asked him what he was doing at the time of the murder, he claimed that he was writing letters inside his home, but police didn't believe his alibi. Police gave Chester a polygraph test and failed 3 different times, which grew the suspicion of law enforcement. But when they did a background check on Chester and learned about his past, they were starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. In 1959, a year before the triple murders, in Madison State Park, just about 2 miles away from Starved Rock, a high school couple were going on a hike, and as the sun was about to set, they were about to enter their car and leave. A man approached them with a gun and threatened to kill both of them if they didn't comply to his command. He robbed a teenage boy, but raped the teenage girl, and had used binding rope to tie both of them up, and had left them after the assault was finished. A few hours had passed by, and the couple freed themselves, and they went straight to the LaSalle County Sheriff Office, and they gave a description of the man as being young, white, and having blue eyes. When the couple told the police about the incident, the police didn't believe that the story was true, and they thought that the couple was lying. But what the police did take was the binding rope that was used to tie the couple up. When the police realized that the same type of binding rope was used for the rape and for the triple murder, they knew they were heading in the right direction. The description of the man the girl told matched the description of Chester, who was already a suspect in the triple murder due to the polygraph and eyewitness. So without a hunch, police got a headshot of Chester and mixed it in with other suspects, and went back to the teenage girl's house a year later with the photo lineup. She was able to identify Chester being the man who raped her and robbed her boyfriend back in 1959. Harold Warren was the LaSalle County State's attorney at the time and obtained an arrest warrant for Chester Weger for the rape and robbery of 1959. Police were more focused on getting Chester to confess to the triple murder case than the robbery and rape charge. And on the first night when Chester was in jail, during the police interrogation, investigators threatened Chester to confess to the triple murder case, and that if he didn't, he would be convicted and be sentenced to death by the electric chair, long before Illinois abolished the death penalty. Hours into the interrogation, Chester kept denying the fact that he knew the 3 women and that he never saw them. But as time passed by, he was mentally breaking down and was about to confess. And when investigators seized the idea that his wife would cheat on him and divorce him while he was away in prison, tears were coming down his face, and he confessed by saying in his own words, "Alright, I did it," and signed the documents. And on November 17, 1960, the grand jury indicts Chester with 3 counts of murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and rape. With his confession, he led the investigators back to the crime scene the next day where the 3 women were murdered. Chester claimed that it was a robbery that had gone wrong, and that the 3 women refused to give up their purse and belongings, and that's when Chester used violence to obtain the items. As Chester was reenacting the murders after he confessed, he told the investigators an interesting piece of information. On the day of the murder, he saw 2 airplanes, a red and white one, flying over him while he was getting rid of the bodies, and police wanted to know if he was telling the truth. So police wanted to track down the 2 airplanes and see if they can find it. So they went to the local Ottawa airport and asked the workers if they saw the 2 airplanes flying around at the area at the time of the murder. The police Police gave a description of the airplanes and they were able to locate both of the planes, and when they checked the logbook, it matched Chester's story and matched the time and date that the airplanes were in the sky. Police knew that what Chester was saying was the truth, and on March 4th, 1961, on Chester's 22nd birthday, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the triple murders and rape. But due to his cooperation and confession, he didn't receive the death penalty. One of the reasons why he didn't receive the death penalty was because during his trial, his children and wife would attend every single court hearing that he had, and it was tough for jurors to sentence a man to death while he had children. The jurors asked themselves, what would life be like for two children if the courts decide to end his life and let the children grow up without a father, even though of his heinous crimes that he committed? Chester Weger was convicted and found guilty for the triple murders and rape, and entered prison in April of 1961 and was sentenced to life. He served time throughout different penitentiaries all throughout Illinois, but in the end, Chester served almost 60 years behind bars, being sent away when he was 22, all the way until the age of 81. Through his sentence and good behavior, Chester was eligible for parole multiple times, but during his sentence kept getting denied parole due to the violence and nature of his crime. He was denied parole 24 different times, before the parole board finally voted that he would be free. And on February 21st, 2020, Chester was released from Pinckneyville Correctional Center and living the remainder of his life with his two children. But one question that prosecutors and true crime fanatics have had after 60 years after the murders was, how was one man able to murder 3 women without the assist of another person, with no firearm and only a frozen tree limb? What do you think? So there you guys have it. 2 murder cases in Illinois that you guys haven't heard about. Any questions or suggestions on what case to make a video about, leave a comment under the comment section. Or if you want me to do a one-on-one interview with Chester Weger himself and explain his side of the story about the case, let me know. Until then, see you guys in the next video.